Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, February 9th, 1886, Seattle, Washington is under martial law. Tensions had been brewing in Seattle for months, centered in the Chinese district, where there was increasing competition and anger over the lack of jobs. There were violent outbreaks against Chinese immigrants and workers throughout the 1870s and 80s, and then at this moment, in early 1886, a group of people claiming to be health inspectors went into Seattle's Chinatown, and this mob, we'll call it a mob, declared Chinese-occupied buildings unfit for habitation and herded the residents to the harbor, where they tried to funnel some 350 people onto a ship called the Queen of the Pacific. Basically, mob violence trying to extract a bunch of workers and immigrants from Chinatown and put them on a ship, and who knows what after that. But local police did nothing to challenge this mob. Someone from a militia, though, that had been called by the governor, fired into the crowd, killing at least one person and injuring others and causing chaos. And that is when President Grover Cleveland intervened, declaring martial law in Seattle. And that began on this day, February 9th, and it would last well into the summer. So here to discuss those Seattle riots and these larger issues of Chinese immigration, labor disputes, is, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Niki.
Hey there, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello, Kellie.
Hey.
Niki, you want to take us to that day, February 9th, 1886, and what we know about that incident, but then also these larger tensions between Chinese workers and other workers?
Yeah, so you can imagine the terror that existed for many Chinese immigrants in Seattle on this morning. There had been for weeks talk of expelling Chinese people from the city. And so 150 Chinese people left of their own accord because they were afraid that there was going to be violence. And for the rest, as you were saying, they got taken over to the docks to have them shipped away. And the impulse behind that, or the thing that was fueling that, was competition over jobs. Chinese migrants in Seattle tended not to be unionized. White workers in Seattle tended to be unionized. And so they saw them as cheap labor and competition and began to violently expel them from the city.
Yeah. One interesting tidbit, or I don't know if interesting is the right word, but one tidbit in this story is that when this mob that had been worked up and tried to put people on a boat, they quickly realized that they didn't have the money to pay for the passage of this boat and actually sort of remove people from Seattle. And so they ended up, taking some of them and putting them on a train and just kind of, they hadn't really thought it through, I guess.
They hadn't done the proper fundraising for their ethnic cleansing. And so it takes them a little longer than they had planned.
Yeah. Kellie, I want to get to the sort of larger story of Chinese immigrants and labor and the sort of decades of what got us to this moment. But I want to switch just slightly because right before we started taping, you talked about how an intervention here by the federal government and declaring martial law, this reminded you a lot of what was happening in Reconstruction throughout the South. You want to kind of make that parallel and talk about kind of why this is playing out elsewhere too?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a common theme that we see happen in America, particularly with people of color. It's always about expulsion and removal, exploitation of their labor. But then after that labor has been extracted, then it's always about expulsion. And so we see these same sort of riots and mob attacks, even massacres, take place right after Reconstruction. Actually, during Reconstruction, right after Reconstruction, Black communities all throughout the South are vulnerable to these same sort of attacks, mobs, riots, lynchings. The federal government is almost always brought in to quail. Ulysses S. Grant, most notably, had to bring in federal troops to shut down the Ku Klux Klan when riot attacks took place in various cities throughout the South and the former Confederacy. So this is definitely a trend that we see happening over and over again.
Yeah. And so to sort of complete that parallel, my sense is that when the federal government intervenes in the wake of this kind of violence, they're not doing so for noble reasons to, protect either blacks or an immigrant community. They're mostly doing it to quell violence and just sort of like say, this has got to stop.
Absolutely, to keep the peace. But they're not about, necessarily disrupting the status quo.
Right, or protecting a persecuted group. And is that your sense, Niki, here with what Grover Cleveland is doing when he declares martial law in Seattle?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. government was actually bound to protect Chinese migrants and the railroads that they had been working on in an earlier era through a treaty called the Burlingame Treaty. And so there was a positive obligation to protect Chinese workers from violence. But at this point in time, Cleveland isn't sending the militia out there to do that. He's sending the militia out there in order to prevent this kind of disruption and social and political unrest.
Yeah. And so you hinted at the kind of decades here where Chinese immigrants and Chinese labor really built the West. And so why, then, is it that a decade or two after that, we end up at this moment where there's just such enormous tension?
So a big part of it is, Chinese migrants had been working in mining, they'd been working on railroad construction, but as that work starts to dry up and there are other competitors for those jobs, in places like Seattle, you have Chinese workers coming in and working urban jobs and putting them in competition with white laborers. So that's part of what's happening here. And the late 19th century is full of boom and bust cycles. So there are these long periods of high unemployment that is also fueling a lot of anger that is then being directed at Chinese workers. And this is happening throughout the 1870s, the 1880s, and 1877 in San Francisco. There's a moment when a bunch of white workers attack Chinatown there. It's happening all across the West as white workers who believe that they deserve the jobs first to try to violently expel and fight back against these Chinese workers.
Especially when they feel like they're in competition, when Chinese workers are used to stop strikes. And so they see them as directly undermining their ability to make a particular wage when Chinese laborers could come in and work for a cheaper wage. It hindered all of their abilities to secure wealth for themselves. So, a lot of these tensions are racial, but they're always undergirded by economic competition.
Yeah, I think we've forgotten to mention one villain here, which are all the corporations who are underpaying Chinese laborers and using them to break strikes and to break the backs of these unions.
Right. It is worth pointing out a lot of white workers are immigrants themselves, but there is not that kind of solidarity when it comes down, I guess, to labor issues. I am fascinated by this labor component here because there's a version of thinking of labor unions as genuine solidarity in which all workers who come to this country, unite. But so often we've seen in the history of labor and in this moment as well that, unions themselves are used for exclusion and division as much as anything.
Yeah, this is one of the stories of American labor organizing. Do you create cross-racial alliances and therefore strengthen the power of the union? Or do you create exclusionary, white only, or you don't allow black people in, or you don't allow Jewish people in, or you create exclusions in order to play off of the racial solidarity or the gender solidarity of your workers in order to wield power that way. But the whole story of American union organizing is this story. I think that the only truly inclusive union was the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies.
Yes, thank you for bringing those up. I did my undergraduate thesis on the Wobblies, and so, yes, they were the only ones who really said, like, there's a genuine solidarity here among all groups, and otherwise it was really a zero-sum game and people trying to get their hands around what they could at any given moment. What strikes me, Kellie, is like a real betrayal of Chinese workers and Chinese immigrants. I mean, in 1882, there's the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I think really codifies a lot of this. But, this is a group that built the West and then was abandoned.
Yeah. If we think about the introduction to the Chinese in the 1840s with the gold rush. So by the time you get to the 1880s, we're talking second and third generation Chinese Americans. These are people that have been here for quite some time. And so I think we also have to consider that as well. Not everyone is newly arrived. There are people who have established their communities, their towns, their networks, and they feel very connected to the United States and are not necessarily intending to go back to China. And so this is also something that we see, we talked about this with the ACS, about Black Americans who were born in America and don't have a real desire to migrate to Liberia. I think when we think about the formation of the United States, the Chinese helped build this country and felt invested in staying.
And you're right, Jody, that there was, in response to all of this violence, a real push for legal exclusion. So you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevents any further migration from China to the U.S. That would be in place until 1943. Yeah. And you also had local segregation laws. This is also parallels the story that Kellie was telling about Reconstruction, about the post-Reconstruction era, which is you use violence to begin to police racial lines, and then you use the legal apparatus to continue to create that second-class citizenship with less violence to hold it in place.
Let's come back as we start to wrap up to this riot in February of 1886. First, we should say that most who were shuttled onto that boat, many of them remained in Seattle. There was violence, but I think the community was able to stay intact in many ways. And there was a sort of legal fallout from this, Niki, but one that I was a little surprised by. So tell us about the $276,619.15 that came at the end of all this.
So that is the amount of money that Congress sent, in their words, out of humane consideration and without reference to liability, right? We're not admitting any guilt here, but out of the generosity of our hearts, we are going to send this $250,000 to the Chinese government. They don't pay the people who were attacked. They don't pay the people who were purged. They send this money to the Chinese government, in large part, again, because of the Burlingame Treaty, right? They had made this deal with the Chinese government that they were going to protect these people. And so they saw whatever obligation they had to this other nation, not to the people who had been hurt.
We've seen this before, too, right?
How so?
I mean, when we talked about the 13th Amendment and offering compensation to slaveholders, not the enslaved, but slaveholders, this is once again a common theme of who gets rewarded or compensated. And it's almost always never those who have been most harmed.
Always redistributing wealth to the wrong people.
Yes.
Right. But I mean, it is something to keep in mind when you hear people say, well, we've never had reparations in this country. It's like, well, we have, but they've just been a little perverse and twisted and sort of directed in the wrong place. We should clarify that amount of money. That was $330 million in today's money. That's not nothing. And that would have really gone a long way to help heal a community that had been targeted. But again, as we said, it went instead to the government of China. All right, well, let's start to wrap up there. And I do want to mention one also on this day. So 1907. On this day is the Mud March, which is a procession organized by the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. Niki?
Yeah, I mean, this is a hat tip to our British listeners. This happens in London. It's one of the first suffrage marches, and it's called the Mud March because there was just a downpour in the middle of it, and the women kept marching, and they were covered with mud by the end of it.
There you go. And this is also a good chance for me to say we get a fair number of notes from listeners saying we should cover political events that happen elsewhere, in Europe or elsewhere in the world. And my response to that is, absolutely. As soon as we get through everything that has happened in American history, we will turn to the rest of the world. So just hang tight. We're getting there. We're checking things off the list. And then we'll turn into this day in world political history. Okay, that brings us to the end of the show. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And thank you, Kellie Carter-Jackson.
Thank you.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Find out lots more about the show, including bios for all of us and a way to get in touch at thisdaypod.com. You can also email us, thisdaypod@gmail.com. I will also say on that site there is a forum where if you want to support the show directly, listener support is a big part of how we make this show go. You can find a form there and become a monthly contributor, a one-time contributor, or just send us a note and say hello. My name is Jody Abergin. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia from